Hello and welcome to Forgotten Fronts. In today's episode, we play the mission, The Fight at the Brickyard, where we take command of Avery's brigade to destroy the final elements of the 11th Corps. But first, the history. If you don't want to hear the history, a time will come up on your screen. If I'm not too lazy or forget this time, wait for it. Now! Responding to the extension of the 11th Corps line, Early orders forth Gordon's Georgians, who pushed them back to the almshouse. With Gordon's men exhausted, Early around 3:45 and 4 orders forth Hay and Hoke's brigade. Hay's brigade on the right and Hoke's brigade on the left of the Heidelberg Road. Note that Hoke's brigade was under the command of Isaac Avery, as Hoke recovered from wounds received at Chancellorsville. The two brigades numbered 3,000 men in 8 large regiments, compared to the Union forces in 3 regiments, with 1 reserve. Without the reserve, they numbered 977 men. The numbers were so in favor of the Confederate forces that they advanced in solid column, not bothering to form line of battle, with only a screen of skirmishers for protection. As the Confederates continued their advance, they drive back isolated skirmishers by Rock Creek and the almshouse. As the Confederates crossed the creek, 200 yards away from the town, they were blasted by canister and slowed by the water. From the creek, the Confederates are ordered forth at the double to the Brickyard. Since Howard was reluctant to weaken the position of Cemetery Hill to give reinforcements to the 11th, Custer's brigade was only deployed at the Brickyard shortly before the Confederates arrive. The position was also disadvantageous to the men, as a small rise in the ground north of the Brickyard reduced their line of sight. This was worsened by ripened wheat at its top. As a result, the Confederates were only 220 yards away when they were seen. Hay's brigade was too far west to face the main brunt of the defense of the Brickyard, or arrived slightly later than Avery. As the brigades approached, they took withering fire. Avery's brigade of North Carolinians waited on the other side of the tree-lined creek, hearing the distant crackles of gunfire and explosions of battle, seeing the fleeing blue-coated men of the 11th Corps through the filthy-smelling smoke blowing away in the wind, when a galloper splashed across the creek, handing Avery a dispatch from Jubal Early. The dispatch ordered the brigade forward to drive the last of the 11th Corps from the Brickyard, with support of Avery's brigade on their right. With a quick look through his field glasses, seeing the smoke that billowed over the spires of Gettysburg, he ordered the brigade forward, with the point of a gloved hand and a thunderous shout. The brigade was ordered along a tributary of Rock Creek, called Stevens Run, where the trees stopped lining it and the rails of fence stopped for the body of water. As the brigade formed solid columns and advanced in splendid style from the trees twigs snapping underfoot as the brigade advanced into the sea of fleeing Yankees. On the other side of the Harrisburg Road, he could see that Hay's brigade had not begun their advance. Assuming the galloper with Hay's orders had not arrived yet, Avery spurred his mount towards the Brickyard. Avery was at the head of the 6th North Carolina, their officer saluting him with his sword, and some of his men raised their hats as they left the trees that lined the creek. Then the artillery on the Yankee flank barked shortly and suddenly, their muzzle flashes and roars almost constantly billowing smoke. Shells screeched overhead as the columns of the brigade continued their advance, reaching and vaulting over a fence by the run, scarred by bullets from the previous engagement. As they advanced, they kicked up large clouds of dust from their toughened, shoeless feet. Then Avery ordered his brigade into battle line, a little closer to the creek, allowing the regiments of his brigade to form it to attack their position. The column of gray troops followed their blood-red banner past the stinking bodies and abandoned equipment of the men of the 11th Corps, as 2 dogs fought over an intestine in a shell hole. The 6th then crossed the stream, creating a muddy slop of a crossing. The horse that Avery rode struggled to get across the newly created sucking mud. As they began to march, tripping over bodies and slipping in blood to the Brickyard, Avery looks through his field glasses to the front, where he can see most of the 11th Corps with their torn colors making their way through the town. As they advanced, some of the men muttered a quick prayer of protection for the coming fight. The 2 veteran regiments in Butternut formed a line, while the more junior regiment moved to vault across a fence farther back. But before any of the regiments got into line, Avery ordered them forward once again, ordering the brigade to form double line on the right flank of the Yankees at the Brickyard. As the regiment formed line once again, their banners bobbing as they advanced in a splendid fashion, the 21st North Carolina formed line and slowly advanced, vaulting over a snake rail fence and their leftmost companies in the mud of the creek, thus slowing the entire regiment. In the center, Avery led the charge, shouting rallying cries to his men, with his hat in hand. In the Brickyard, shouts of alarm in English and in German rippled down the line, one of their officers drawing his sword announcing, "Ready, boys, Johnny Reb's on the way!" Despite their odds, the men managed to stay and face their overwhelming gray-clad enemies, hats filled with percussion caps and cartridges nearby to allow for rapid reloading. On both sides, men were terrified of being killed, or even worse, wounded, to be left on the field until nightfall at the mercy of carrion birds and scavengers. As the 21st reached another rail fence, Avery ordered the brigade forward a few more yards, and the men marched, following their officers' pointed swords. The 21st advanced in the open. Men look grimly forward as one man mutters, "For what we're about to receive, may the Lord make us truly grateful." Their ranks opened as the Yankees rested their rifles on the rail fence, pulling back their hammers. The 6th North Carolina in the meantime flanked wide around the Yankee right in a column of the likes that Napoleon's army would recognize. The 21st North Carolina advanced to fire and to keep the Yankees' heads down, but the Yankees got off the first volley, their musket flames long and whip thin, but in their nervousness their bullets whipped high and hissed overhead. The men of the 21st involuntarily ducked as balls smacked their colors, tearing the holes in the cloth and nicking the staff. The 21st quickly returned fire, their muzzle flash throwing up great clouds of smoke and sparks. The men quickly reload, ramming the powder and ball down their barrels hard. A shell explodes overhead with a thump and a cloud of black smoke blasting twisted metal into the 6th. A man was hit with shrapnel, cutting a bloody groove in his arm. He let out a terrible scream as he carried on for a few paces before collapsing in shock. Their column began to break up before their sergeants growled at the companies, and they reformed once again as 2 more shells crashed overhead. The overeager officer of the 57th North Carolina ordered his men to follow the 6th advance. As the column closed, it resumed its advance as a small regiment in the Brickyard rushed toward the flank in a desperate attempt to stop them. The officer of the bloody 6th then ordered his men at the double to the edge of Stevens Run. The regiment then formed battle line at the double, pulling back the heavy hammers of their rifles, opening ranks and preparing to fire. Men knew that volleys at such a range would be slaughter work, and their officers thumbed back the hammers of their revolvers, yelling, "Give those Prussian bastards a volley!" And then a storm of bullets crashed into the Yankees. Our regiment formed line across the stream, firing volleys at the Yankees up close. Firing at long range is easy, you cannot hear the screams as clearly, and see the faces twist as balls drill into their chest. As smoke exploded down the ranks of the 6th, the men quickly upended their rifles, biting and pouring the contents of a new cartridge down their rifle's hot barrel. At the same time, the men of the 57th continued their advance, slowly and less eagerly than at first, their officer pointing his sword forward, but trembling, his vision dazed in the smoke. The 21st was ordered forth, but a maelstrom of lead from the Brickyard quickly halted them, the balls producing clouds of droplets of blood and bone from screaming men where they made contact. Then a runner from the 6th ran to Avery, saying that there was another Yankee regiment approaching their left flank. Avery then ordered the 57th to the left flank at the double. They obeyed, their officer pointing his darkened sword forward, ordering his men to the rail fence on the left flank, their bugle blaring through the crackle of rifles. His men passed the 6th, bullets cutting over their heads, some of them finding their mark and thudding into the men of the regiment on their right, who gasped in pain as they sunk to the ground. Avery looked to his right and saw dark shadows in the ever-increasing cloud bank. The figures were the men of the 21st, whom he ordered forth once again, yelling loudly and hoarsely in the roar of battle. At the same time, the Yankees moved a 3rd and final regiment in the Brickyard to the right flank at the double, moving to counter the 57th. In the meantime, the 57th are about to arrive at the fence line. "Hurry! For God's sake, hurry!" yelled their officer as a Yankee regiment on the fence line parallel wheels to face them, leveling the heavy barrels of their rifles in a blistering volley that our men quickly return. The 6th continued to pour fire into the Yankees across Stevens Run. The men quickly drained their canteens of their precious contents in the rapidly increasing heat. The officer of the 21st was finally able to order his men forward in the open ground. Seeing that his orders were followed, Avery galloped in between the 6th and 57th to rally them. The 3rd Yankee Battalion rushed forward into Stevens Run, into the blood-red water, seeking shelter. The 21st rushed forward as bullets slapped past, stopping only 70 yards short of the Yankee position, their faces half-starved, half-fearful, and black with powder smoke and streaked with sweat. Their volley crashed into the 2 Yankee regiments, cutting up the fence and men, throwing them back bloody. Then their officer pointed his sword ahead, and the men let out the terrible shrill rebel yell. As they yelped their hoarse battle cry, they fired and advanced, hitting one of the regiment then the other, routing both and capturing their commander. The noise was terrible, an echo of the medieval days of men being butchered with steel and crushed by clubs. The charge caused the defenders to quickly scuttle away, but no colors were captured. The 21st then rushed the Brickyard with savage whoops of joy. After a short fight, they drove back 2 regiments. Then they dragged their commander from his horse, capturing him as he tried to rally his men. In the aftermath of the charge, the 2 regiments raised like a flock of blackbirds and fled, some of the men limping back, dripping blood. Then the 21st reorganized, rushing past the wounded, limping slowly and painfully to the town. The regiment then formed line in the center of the Brickyard and began pouring deadly rifle fire onto the Yankees. The 6 wheeled right and continued engaging the Yankees with fire, pouring a tide of lead down Stevens Run. All the while, Avery galloped across the firing line, vision blurred in the smoke, almost oblivious to the hail of mini-balls to rally the troops in the Brickyard. Another Yankee regiment bolted towards the fence along Stevens Run, sheltered from the 21st balls by the brick kilns and the storehouse. Then the officer of the 6th ordered his men forward, his spectacles smeared to almost opaqueness with sweat and powder debris. The regiment rushed forward to continue to engage fire with the Yankees. All the while, the 21st and 57th blasted lead towards the Yankees by Stevens Run, the balls letting into men or splashing or splattering in and around the body of water. The 21st continued to tighten the noose around the Yankee Brigade, advancing to push them over Stevens Run. As Avery arrived, encouraging the men with rallying shouts, reminding them of home and the cause in the hellish smoke and rain of bullets. On the right, the Yankee artillery turned right and fired, obscuring them in dense smoke as the gunners rushed forward to load the guns once again. The 21st were ordered forward by Avery again until they were a few paces away from the brick kilns, cracked by balls and shrapnel. Now the 2 Yankee regiments were caught in a cone of lead in Stevens Run. An officer inspired by the charge of the 21st eagerly ordered his men to fix bayonets, and the men of the 57th slotted long blades on blackened barrels.
Them Prussians ain't worth the spirit of a southern soldier. Charge, men! Let them hear you scream!
The 57th rushed forth, following their officer's sword in the billowing smoke. Despite this, the charge hurtled forward in considerable strength. Then the 2 regiments clashed. The men grunted and swore as they swung rifles, slashed with bowie knives, and stabbed forward with bayonets. Some of the Yankees took advantage of this and escaped in the confusion of the melee. For a moment, the 2 officers traded sword slashes. Suddenly in the melee, a pistol was drawn and fired. The officer of the 57th looked down at his reddening tunic and collapsed in a heap. The nearby men looked at him for a moment dumbly before they slowly began to run away. Then a bugle announced the retreat, and one sergeant yelled,
"Boys, we gotta get out of here!"
And the grey-clad infantrymen withdrew. As the 2 regiments separated, the 57th in chaos as the Yankees fired on them. The 6th did their best to cover the retreat of the 57th with their rightmost companies. However, in the smoke, their fire was as deadly as the Yankees' was to the 57th. Between the 2 large Confederate regiments, the Yankee regiments fought on desperately, taking advantage of the banks of Stevens Run and the nearby snake rail fences. In the meantime, the 57th sergeants were able to get their companies in line and reorganize the regiment. The 57th then advanced to support the left flank of the 6th. In the middle of Stevens Run, a small Yankee regiment took shelter in the banks. The Yankees in the stream wheeled left and right as balls hissed through the air and splashed all around them. The water around them was soon reddened and filled with their floating bodies. Wiping away the powder smoke and looking through his field glasses, Avery decides to send a runner to the 57th. He ordered them into reserve by the Brickyard to make sure the junior regiment doesn't make any more reckless charges. The regiment passed the battle line as bullets cracked overhead, some finding their mark, and men fell to the ground cursing and screaming. In the smoke, fire, and blood, some of the men had discarded their kepis in the unspeakable heat. Others had bandanas, blood red from the water of Stevens Run, wrapped around their heads. One of the men attempted to crawl to the rear, dripping blood, shortly after he was hit, only to collapse on his face shortly afterward. As the column rushed behind them, the deadly fire of the 6th had caused the Yankee regiment's fire to slacken. As they began to withdraw, the men of the Yankee regiment shuffled a few paces backward as they reloaded. Other men stopped firing entirely as they attempted to help the wounded. The regiment continued to withdraw, despite the nearby encouraging cries of their nearby brigadier. The 6th in the meantime had been in a close range and bloody fight. Then their officer, in an excellent display of leadership, rushes ahead of the line, grasping their colors and pointing his ash-darkened sword forward.
Boys, I know you fought hard, damn hard. If you give one more good charge, you will send those crowds skedaddling.
The shrill savage yelps and glints of bayonet in the smoke announced the charge of the 6th, and the Yankees fired where they saw a movement, flinging down many of the Confederates on the approach. But the rushing, trampling noise grew closer until the two regiments clashed in another fierce melee.
Kill them crowds!
Yelled a butternut-clad sergeant as his men rammed bayonets hard into jackets. After the short melee, a bugle cut through the confusion and the Yankee regiment withdrew. The 6th reorganized and stood long enough to appear to the Yankee regiment in Stevens Run as if they were to pour fire down onto their flank, and they quickly scattered. Now that the officer's promise was fulfilled, the regiment now withdrew themselves. As the Yankees withdraw, the 21st opened a savage fire upon them, balls thudding into the banks of Stevens Run or thudding into men who splashed down into the creek, some men falling as corpses, others wounded who drowned quickly in the bloody water of the run. Seeing the 6th withdraw, the 57th advanced to take up position along the solid fence without orders to support the left flank of the 21st. The men ran past the brick kilns over the white-faced wounded who were being hauled to the rear, gasping in pain. The Yankee brigadier looked in confusion at the fugitives of the 6th, who withdrew along Stevens Run in promiscuous confusion. As the 57th advanced along the rail fence, the 21st advanced over the blood-flecked grounds of the Brickyard to the southernmost fence. All the while, the two regiments that were forced from the Brickyard limped to the rear, their colors torn, ragged, and stained with powder smoke. Not long afterward, the 6th was able to withdraw, with sergeants and officers spitting fire hotter than hell and formed into column, marching back into the Brickyard. As the 6th moved to the Brickyard, fat trickles of Yankee wounded limped to the town of Gettysburg, followed by their brigadier general. The regiment also passed the wounded of the recent fight in the Brickyard, calling out for aid. Their uniforms bloody and torn, the men sought their revenge.
"Don't leave me!"
gurgled a wounded man, his tunic shot through and stained red, blood leaking from his mouth. The 21st arrive at the fence as the sulphur smoke clears, and so does the roar of battle, except for the far-off crackling of muskets from Hayes' brigade, who continue to attack the Yankee artillery. The red flags and colorfully striped state flags of Hayes' brigade charged the Yankee cannon, with yells as sharp as their bayonets. The cannon blasted in response, shredding the men, throwing out great clouds of dust flecked with blood. The roar of battle was quickly replaced with the cries of the wounded, as they call out to be helped to the nearest field hospital. All the while, a horde of stretcher-bearers descend upon the Brickyard from both the town and the Confederate lines over Rock Creek. As the stretcher-bearers approach, the new defenders of the Brickyard prepare for the counterattack, moving kepis filled with percussion caps and cartridges abandoned by the Yankees to the southernmost fence. Runners from the regiment distribute ammunition and water from the dead. The men move along the rail fence were parched and hurting, helpless from the days of fighting.
As the men moved to take cover behind the rail fence, they were surrounded by wounded and dead. Our wounded called out to our officers for stretcher bearers while the Yankees cursed at us in English and in German, while other Yankees still attempted to crawl away to the town, leaving bloody trails. As the 57th take up their position along the strong rail fence, the 6th move up in column to arrive at their positions in the Brickyard. Men continued to rush about, preparing for the counterattack that was sure to come. A small party of men moved to the rear to start a fire to boil water to scour the barrels of their rifles, while others moved bodies away from the fence, redistributing their ammunition and canteens. All the while, stretcher bearers continued to take away the squirming and moaning wounded. As the 6 arrived, their officer closes the sad gaps created by wounded and killed, while the brigade made their defensive preparations. In the backdrop was a blaze blood and danger of the continued assault on the Yankee artillery by Hayes' brigade. This assault continued successfully to push back the artillery by the Gettysburg College. Meanwhile, the troops in the Brickyard scanned the windows of Gettysburg with wild eyes. The last of the retreating Yankees and the wisps of smoke from Hayes' attack created sharpshooters in the windows taking aim. Some of the soldiers returned fire, breaking the windows until corporals and sergeants got their men under control again. To the right, Hayes' brigade was successful and reforms his brigade into line to continue the assault to drive the withdrawing artillery and to threaten Cemetery Ridge. Then another courier rides up to Avery, giving him a report of the battle. A.P. Hill's troops were stalled along the ridges, and so were Robert Rhodes's troops on Oak Hill, leaving the rear of the Yankees exposed as they attempted to stop them. Looking through his field glasses, it appears that Hayes' brigade was taking advantage of this. However, Avery decided to wait for orders to attack and so held his position, while others decided to stack some bricks along the rail fences to provide cover. As the men prepared and waited, no counterattack came. The wait was maddening. Avery scanned the horizon with his field glasses, but no attack came still. In the meantime, the narrator broke the fourth wall and sped up time until something happened. Then from the town came the last of our regiments, covered in bandages. The regiment was led by their color bearers, bearing mere rags instead of colors, nearby wounded cheering them on pitifully. Then the counterattack came, a single regiment led by torn and powder-stained colors. Their men made one last desperate, tired, frantic advance to a hoarse battle cry. Expecting a long engagement, the 6th move into the position of the 57th, while they form into columns of 4s and move farther down the rail fence. All the while, the stretcher bearers of both sides, as quickly as they could, vacate the brickyard with stretchers full of moaning wounded, rushing past the bleeding wounded who pleaded for water, a doctor, or help reaching the nearest field hospital. The men of the 6th steadied their rifles on the rail fence, the weight driving them insane as they expected more regiments to suddenly emerge from the town. The men pulled back the heavy hammers of their rifles and put on fresh percussion caps of their rifles' cones. The 57th vaulted the rail fence as the bloody Yankee regiment forms line, slowing their advance as the wounded struggled to keep up and slowed them down. Then the men struggled over a rail fence that ran parallel to the stream, especially the wounded, whom some of the men helped over, trampling the ever-increasing piles of dead and dying, surrounded by red blood and grey gore. Then the temporary officer of the 57th ordered his regiment into column and to cross the run to flank the attacking troops. Then a cannon limber broke through the rail fence, turning it into matchwood as it rumbled through our lines. The limber crushed a few men who were too slow to move. Then another part of the limber crashed through the fence, breaking another section. Then the limber ground to a halt and the gunners were soon surrounded by a ring of steel. The 57th then forms column, crossing the run, passing corpses of the recent fight, flies beginning to descend on the foul-smelling bodies. The 57th now crossed Stevens Run, the water red with blood and filled with bodies and parts of uniforms and equipment floating down it. The 57th rushed out of the horrible water and scrambled up the muddy bank, following their tattered red banner, forming line on the left flank of the 6th, preparing to sweep away the fleeing Yankees. Debris from the cartridges causing small fires amongst the grass, blackening the powder smoke and increasing the heat. Blood hissed as it made contact with the flames, only making the smell of battle more unbearable. The 21st wheeled to face the attacking Yankee regiment. However, some of its companies struggled to form between the storage shed and the brick kilns. The regiment formed an almost right angle to the approaching regiment. At the same time, the 6th opened fire on the approaching Yankee regiment, who quickly fled. August 1914.
Welcome to my lecture on the Franco-German Resource War and the Valley Campaign from 1900 to present. Now to review from the last lecture, who knows the causes of the war? Jen. The Germans wanted to prevent the spread of radicals from the Paris Commune by taking the Saarland. Not quite. Davis? The French wanted to prevent the rise of power of Germany by tipping the balance of power in Europe, threatening the peace. Both good answers, but the cause for the war was a lack of resources for both of the powers to industrialize fully, drawing both of the powers into this lengthy war, which in turn ironically destroyed most of the coal deposits, and what little remains in the region had been drawn into the two powers' war efforts. Sir, why haven't we been drawn into this conflict? Don't we have a need for coal as well? We do, but thanks to our colonies, we are spared from such a fate. But we do not choose a side, then. The Foreign Office doesn't want us to support such militarized governments.